And that really sets me up well to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Dave Burdick from the University of New Hampshire, who's going to go over a little bit of the science and rationale behind living shorelines. Dave?
Thanks, Cory.
Sure.
Well, you set me up very well here. Hopefully the button's going to work for me. I hope I can be not too rushed, but I'm going to just move right along because we only have a few minutes to talk about some basic information. So I'm giving you the Living Shorelines 101. And so a lot of our teams know most all of this. Maybe you'll see something new, maybe not, that I can share with you. There's always new information. We got new information last week, so we'll include that too. So what are living shorelines? I'm not going to give you the standard definition from the Corps or NOAA. What I want to do is I want you to think about how we want to create structures, a combination of natural and artificial structures. And the natural component is going to be what I call a biogenic habitat. So the organisms of the habitat make the habitat. Organisms actually construct the habitat and make it, they interact with the physical processes to create a habitat that we all recognize. So a combination of artificial and biogenic habitat that's based on and supported by dynamic physical and biological properties to promote healthy, stabilized shorelines. So that's sort of my internal definition. Another component of this is continuity. So Cory told you all about how important these living shorelines are, but you can see the difference in continuity when you have a stone wall, a vertical seawall versus some sort of a gradient that's a little more sloping. And we'll talk a little bit about that. This is Wagon Hill Farm. We're probably going to recognize this. We'll probably see it 12 times today. So what's not a living shoreline? Anything that doesn't use natural components that are living. So bulkheads, seawalls, revetments, you've probably seen these. We could put these in a continuum. So we can go to a completely green shoreline with no artificial components. I don't typically call that a living shoreline because there's no artificial components, but some people include it. So just plant-based, no help at all. But this lower edge often needs some help because there's erosion forces always going on. That's why we're working on these sites. So it goes from edging to sills to breakwaters to little bulkheads. You don't see the different combinations of more grayer solutions here, but there can be some different combinations with green and gray out there, terrace systems, a riprap with large spaces in between the stones so you can plant and have live marsh between the stones, going to the gray systems. So why living shorelines? Well, as sea level rises and we're getting more storms more often, there's greater erosion and people are seeing the erosion. Everyone's tuned into it a lot more than they were 50 years ago. So people are getting excited about seeing erosion loss, especially after storms. And typically in an unhealthy system or a broken system, these systems will erode and then the erosion actually gets worse. So it sort of compounds itself. Whereas in a healthy system, what you don't have to worry about, they usually can take care of themselves and heal themselves. So people don't worry about those. So the bad systems are getting a lot of attention. We've lost about 30% of our salt marshes in New Hampshire. And this is not Great Bay estuary, but it's Hampton Seabrook estuary because it's so dramatic. All this yellow is high marsh, and this light blue is low marsh. And with 6.5 feet of sea level rise over 60 or 70, 80 years in one scenario, even though the marsh is building, this all turns into mudflat. So the purple is mudflat. So we're going to be losing more marshes probably in the future. So it would be great to combine this increased need with armoring with salt marsh components that can actually help with the erosion problem. So in the world of living shorelines, we have lots of different types of biogenic habitats that can work. We have beaches and dunes. Beach doesn't usually have a living component, but there's a dune behind it. So that's why I say beaches and dunes. So that beach dune system actually includes an offshore bar. So the offshore bar, beach, and dune system, they all interact to trade sand back and forth over time. And the grasses are a critical component of storing that sand in large vertical structures called dunes that then is eroded out to that offshore bar and then comes back in the summer and stuff. But in Great Bay, we're just really focused on Great Bay. It's grants for Great Bay. So we don't have an open shoreline. We have little bits of open shoreline at Odiorn Point, perhaps Newcastle, but we're not going to focus on that. So we're going to exclude that for now. The tidal salt marshes or tidal marshes, yes, that's a good fit. We'll talk about why. Mangroves are great, but you can't have it freeze in the winter. So if you're in Florida or the Gulf Coast or Texas, you can use perhaps mangroves, but not us. Oyster reefs are great, and oysters are all about, this area is lots of oysters. The problem is we have 9-foot tides, and an oyster reef has to be subtidal because of freezing in winter. Everything just freezes so cold. It's just so cold in the winter. It's got to be subtidal. So if the oysters are subtidal and your marsh can't start until, or your shoreline, the shoreline vegetation can't start till above the half tide line, what's going to protect it? There's nothing to fit there. So it doesn't really work. You could build oyster reefs into a project. It could be part of a project, but it's not going to really function very well in terms of the living shoreline. So it's a little bit too cold with a wide range. Coral reefs, again, great, but we don't live in a place where coral reefs can survive because of the cold winter. We have SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation. That could be great, again, but it has the same problem with oyster reefs. It's only subtidal. And then we have rocky intertidal shorelines. Yes, we do have that around Great Bay. So what you're going to see today is probably a big combination of this rocky intertidal shoreline and tidal marsh for most of these systems. So that's what we're sort of left with. And what do we want to do here? Well, this is the standard. This could be riprap. It could be a vertical seawall. But you can see what's going on here. This is a cross section from mudflat. And then here we have some marsh plants, which go poof with sea level rise because they can't, there's no place for them to migrate when you have a seawall here. And then you have upland lawn or grasses. We see this over and over again. All you folks out here have been seeing that. So we don't want that paradigm. We want to change that paradigm so that we can have some more of this living marsh, because this living marsh does a bunch of things. So I don't know if this is a pointer or not. Yeah. So this living marsh. So now instead of having no intertidal living marsh and no continuity, now you have a living thing gets flooded twice a day or once a day by the tides. Organisms can swim up here, crawl up here, come back up and down, and you have a continuity of rich wetland habitats when you have this. So that's really the difference between the living shoreline in Great Bay and traditional gray shoreline. Okay. This can be looked at other ways. Here we have, again, totally grass with sill, with rock. So it goes from green to gray again. I just wanted to bring that in again. I want to talk a little bit about the values of the salt marshes. So plant growth to support food webs. That plant energy supports secondary production, the animals that live there. This biodiversity is important because animals and plants that only live or critically need this habitat. It protects areas from flooding and erosion. It removes sediments and nutrients from the water. There's aesthetic values, and it's a self-sustaining ecosystem. So we're trying to create systems that will interact with the types of physical forces that are there so that they will last for tens and tens of years. We know sea level rise is coming up faster, but we're looking forward. When we design these things, we have to design them for, let's try to design them for 30 to 50 to 70 years in the future. And oh my gosh, they store carbon. So the fact that salt marshes and other biogenic habitats like mangroves and seagrasses, they store carbon, that's a positive in terms of reducing climate change. A couple little guys I want to talk about. So some birds only nest on the salt marsh, like the salt marsh sparrow. And so these critters are going to have a hard time as sea level rises. So the more habitats we can make that can migrate landward, the more opportunities these guys might have to survive rather than getting closed out of the system. And then I put Atlantic silversides in here because Atlantic silversides only lay their eggs in little bits of algae at the base of Spartina alterniflora. So it's a wonderful study done by those gentlemen. And in, I think, Delaware, where they had 4 different types of habitats: alterniflora, Phragmites, bulkhead, and riprap. And 94% of the eggs were found, these guys were found in the algae at the salt marsh. 94%, and only, I think, 4% in everything, but 4% scattered around Phragmites and bulkheads. So really, these guys have evolved to do that. So it's really important to have these types of systems. If we lose all of our systems, even, it's just one little bed along the shoreline, but that's where these guys are going to come and lay their eggs. So it is important. And these marshes are very complex. And so these arrows show physical and biological components interacting with each other, but this is another cross-section of the salt marsh. This is peat. So the below ground biomass partially breaks down and creates a soil volume. And as sea level rises, then this peat will increase in thickness. As sea level falls, the peat will decrease in thickness. But we're not under that scenario. So this is going to be increasing sea level rise, so it's going to increase in thickness. And we can see that if we put a little bit of feldspar clay down on the surface of the marsh and come back in 10 years, we can see that little bit of clay on the surface of the marsh and see how many centimeters, 3.5 centimeters, 35 millimeters grew up over the top of that, which if that was 10 years, it'd be 3.5 millimeters a year, which is a little bit, maybe a little bit more than historical sea level rise, but probably a little less than what we're experiencing now. But these things also are very squishy. So I wanted to show this root. So this is a cross section of a Spartina alterniflora root done by my PhD advisor. And you can see there's a layer of about 5 cells on the outside. And there's a layer of about 20 cells on steel at the inside. This is where the liquids come and go. And I don't even know, you can't even see how this communicates with this outer layer. What about all this? This is what? These are all dead cells. Here's some live ones right in here. All of these are dead. So you can imagine when you step on this root, you're just going to squash it. It's very fragile. And so that's why human traffic on top of salt marshes is really, really stressful for the marsh. It kills these plants through the roots. And that's because there's 2 major stresses. Just in general, all plants in the world, the number 1 stressor is water. If you give plants enough water, light, and nutrients, they'll grow wild. In these wetlands, we have tons of water, but it's salt water. So we have physiological drought because it's salty water. The plants can't drink it, just like we can't drink salt water. So they have to deal with getting the salt out of that salt water. And that's this part. But they're also flooded with this. They're flooded with water. They're flooded so much that roots can't get the oxygen they need to respire. And soils and oxygen sink. And so it has to make those holes in the roots. So those cells, those open spaces, those are all cells that have been killed. So it releases ethylene, the same thing that ripens your apples and your pears and our fruit, is ethylene will kills the cells in the roots, set up to kill the cells so the oxygen can get to the roots and it can support the roots. So these plants are under a lot of stress. So they may look like they grow great, but they're under stress and they only grow in certain heights of tide. So this is just a number line of tides going from 0 to 9 feet of tide. And the low marsh plant only grows in this range. And the high marsh plant really grows up here. And then there's sort of a tidal buffer. So we have to put the plants at the right elevations. Otherwise, we'll be very sad when everything dies. If we have a water level recorder, that's this blue line going up and down twice a day, high tide, low tide, low tide. And we put those elevations of the different parts of the marsh on here, we can see that, yes, the low marsh gets flooded almost every single day. Here's some tides that don't flood the low marsh almost all the time. And the high tides, some parts of if you're up here on this high elevation, you only get flooded a few times a month in the high marsh. So we want to design to be able to capture that. And this is a brand new publication from Rachel and Chris Peter, and I think there was another author. Jamie Carter, yeah, oh yeah, because he's Mr. Tides. And that showed the height of the plants. So this is a low marsh, this is the range of low marsh, and this is based on 1.3 million data points. 1.3 million means of even more data points, right? So this is like fabulous data. So this is the 10 to 90 percentile of the elevations you find low marsh, and these are the high marsh. Same for the high marsh, so you can kind of really get, so this is available now, so we can really get down to what we think is the right elevation for this. So a couple points I wanted to leave you with today. And I'm into my Q&A, so that means I have to stop pretty soon. Great infrastructure is strongest the day they're created, and when you leave, they weaken over time. You can see the backwash coming out here. Nature-based shorelines are weakest the day of construction, and they get stronger over time. Here's Wagon Hill Farm beforehand. You can see there's a lot of erosion. The marsh is slumped down. It's not a happy spot. This is the gondola pier. And the gondola pier is around the corner. You can't see it because everything's filled in and the marshes look good. So lessons learned. Realistic goals and objectives at the outset. Buying engineers and ecologists. Involve permitting agencies early in the project. Have those pre-permitting discussions. Our growing season is short. The plants grow slowly, so use higher densities and clumping. Ice can gouge soft sediments, so think about protection and include maintenance and monitoring. And recognize that some plants and animals like geese and the invasive snail, common periwinkle, are not always welcome to your sites. So we have time for Q&A. Not much, but.
Do we have any questions?
Not in the chat, no.
Okay, great. We can.
Did a good job there.
Great job.
Thank you, David.